Amelia Earhart, a young, ambitious woman, passed away just shy of her 40th birthday, doing something she dearly loved, flying. Amelia was a woman of first. She was the first woman to fly solo across the Atlantic Ocean. She was the first woman to receive a National Geographic Society Gold Medal. She was the first woman to receive a Distinguished Flying Cross, and she was a charter member and the first president of the 99s. Amelia was a legend of the 20th century. Her disappearance while trying to fly around the world is probably her most notable act. How did this young lady become such an icon? Let's take a look at the life of Amelia Earhart. Amelia Mary Earhart was born in Atchison, Kansas on July 24, 1897, to Samuel Edwin Earhart and Amelia Amy Otis Earhart, in the home of her maternal grandparents. Amelia was named after her two grandmothers, Amelia Josephine Otis and Mary Wells Patton. Amelia had one younger sibling, a sister named Grace Marielle Earhart. As a child, Earhart was not the typical little girl. She was more of a tomboy, spending long hours playing with her sister, climbing trees, hunting rats with a rifle, and belly slamming her sled downhill. Her father, Edwin, struggled with his law career. He finally quit his private practice and took a job with the Rock Island Railroad. Amelia lived with her wealthy maternal grandparents, Alfred and Amelia Ayres Otis, until she was 10 years old. While living with her grandparents in Atchison, Kansas, she attended a private school. She spent her summers in Kansas City, Missouri, where her lawyer father worked for the railroad. In 1907, Amelia went to live with her parents in Des Moines, Iowa, where the railroad had transferred her father. While in Des Moines, Amelia saw her first airplane while visiting the state fair. Amelia was not impressed with the airplane. She said, "It was a thing of rust, wire, and wood and not interesting." Granted, this was only 4 years after Wilbur and Orville Wright's first successful airplane flight at Kitty Hawk, North Carolina. During Amelia's teenage years, her father battled alcoholism and lost his job while they were living in St. Paul, Minnesota. Amy left Edwin and took the girls to live in Chicago, Illinois. Amelia graduated from Hyde Park High School in Chicago, Illinois. Her high school yearbook described Amelia, A.E., the girl in brown who walks alone. She did well in science and sports, but never had many friends. After high school, she attended a junior college in Pennsylvania. Earhart ended up leaving there after spending some time in Toronto visiting her sister Marielle. In Toronto, Earhart saw a wounded soldiers come back from World War I, and she decided she wanted to be a Red Cross nurse aide at the military hospital. In her free time while visiting in Toronto, she watched the Royal Flying Corps practice at a nearby airfield. Her real interest in airplanes started in 1917 after attending a stunt flying expedition in Toronto. A stunt pilot spotted Earhart and her friend and dove towards them. They had held their ground. She claimed this incident woke something inside her. She said, "I did not understand it at the time, but I believe the little red airplane said something to me as it swished by." In 1919, Amelia went to New York to enroll in the pre-med program at Columbia University. Amelia stayed at Columbia for 1 year, and after that 1 year, her parents got gotten back together and moved to California, so she followed them. On December 28, 1920, at an airshow in Long Beach, California, pilot Frank Hawks gave her a 10-minute ride in the plane, and that plane changed her life. She said, "By the time I got 200 or 300 feet above the ground, I knew how to fly." In January 1921, Amelia started flying lessons from Anita Snook, a female flight instructor. By working part-time as a file clerk, office assistant, photographer, truck driver, and with some help from her mother, Amelia eventually bought her own plane. The Kinner Airster was a bright yellow used biplane she nicknamed the Canary. Amelia passed her flying license test on December 15, 1921, given by the NAA. In October 1922, she achieved the world altitude record for the women's pilots by flying solo at an altitude of 14,000 feet. On May 15, 1923, Amelia received her international pilot's license from the FAI. She was the 16th woman to receive an international license. In 1924, Earhart's parents divorced. Since the family was having financial trouble, she had to sell the Canary. She sold her plane and bought a car. Amelia and her mother drove to Boston, Massachusetts, where Mariel was living. Amelia re-enrolled at Columbia University, where she lacked the money and left after a year again. Amelia moved back to Boston, where she was becoming a social worker, joined the NAA Boston chapter, and continued to fly in her free time. Earhart received a phone call that changed her life. Captain Hilton H. Riley called asking if she would like to be the first woman to cross the Atlantic Ocean. Of course, Earhart accepted. The flight was an idea of George Palmer Putnam, editor of W.E. Charles Lindbergh's book about how he became the first person to fly alone across the Atlantic in 1927. Putnam could see this story being the bestseller. Putnam chose Amelia for his Lady Lindy because of her flying experience, her education, and her ladylike appearance. She was nicknamed Lady Lindy in an offshoot of Charles Lindbergh's nickname, Lucky Lind, and because of her resemblance to Charles Lindbergh. Along with pilot Wilmer Stoltz and mechanic Lewis Gordon, she crossed the Atlantic from Newfoundland to Wales on June 18th through 19th, 1928. Although she never once touched the controls, she described herself afterwards as just baggage, like a sack of potatoes. Earhart became the world renowned as the first woman to fly the Atlantic. From the time on Putnam became Earhart's manager, and in 1931 her husband, she never took Putnam's name. She wanted the marriage more than the partnership. Putnam and Earhart published the book 20 Hours, 40 Minutes about her trip across the Atlantic with Stoltz and Gordon. Putnam arranged all the flying arrangements, lecture and book tours, and product endorsements. She started writing for the magazine as an aviation editor. In 1929, Earhart helped to create an international organization for the advancement of female pilots called the 99s. She served as its first president. Amelia wanted to establish herself as a respected aviator and started making plans to make a solo flight across the Atlantic Ocean. On May 20th, 1932, 5 years after Charles Lindbergh, Amelia flew solo across the Atlantic Ocean. She took off from Newfoundland, Canada, from the local newspaper from the date she left. She originally was going to follow Lindbergh's flight and land in Paris, France, but she experiences many issues during the flight, from heavy clouds to ice on the wings and mechanical problems. She successfully landed in a pasture in Northern Ireland. The flight gave her the recognition as an international hero. During During the 5 years remaining in her life, Earhart acted as a tireless champion for commercial aviation and for women's rights. She set many flying records, collected numerous awards and honors from around the world over the next few years. In the fall of 1935, until her disappearance, Earhart was hired to be a female career consultant at Purdue University in the aeronautics department. While at Purdue, she was able to get a new twin-engine Lockheed Electra 10E with the money donated by Purdue's president, acquaintances, and manufacturers. She wanted to use the plane as a flying laboratory to study the long effects on long-distance flying on pilots. During her 40th birthday, Amelia mentioned she wanted to be the first woman to fly around the world. Earhart said, "I have a feeling that there is just about one good flight left in my system, and I hope this trip is it." Amelia Earhart's attempt would be the first person to travel the Earth around the equator. Using the Lockheed Electra L-10E from Purdue, Earhart pulled together a top-rated crew of 3 men: Captain Harry Manning, Fred Noonan, and Paul Mans. Manning, who had been the captain of the President Roosevelt, which brought Earhart back from Europe in 1928, would become Earhart's first navigator. Noonan, who has vast experience in both marine and flight navigation, was to be the second navigator. Mans, a Hollywood stunt pilot, was chosen to be Earhart's technical advisor. The original plan was to take off from Oakland, California and fly west to Hawaii. From there, the group would fly across the Pacific Ocean to Australia. Then they would cross the subcontinent of India, on to Africa, then to Florida, and back to California. On March 17, 1937, they took off from Oakland, California on the first leg. They experienced some flying problems flying across the Pacific and landed in Hawaii for some repairs at the United States Navy field on Ford Island in Pearl Harbor. After 3 days, the Electra began its takeoff, but something went wrong. Earhart lost control and looped into the plane on the runway. Several witnesses, including an Associated Press journalist, said they saw a tire blow. Other sources, including Paul Mans, indicated it was a pilot error. Though no one was seriously hurt, the plane was severely damaged and had to be shipped back to California for expensive repairs. In the meantime, Earhart and Putnam secured additional funding for the new flight. The stress of the delay and the fundraising appearances left Amelia exhausted. By the time the plane was repaired, weather patterns and the global changes required alterations to the flight plan. This time, Earhart and her crew would fly east. Captain Harry Manning would not join the team due to previous commitments, and Paul Mans was also absent, reportedly due to contract dispute. Earhart and Noonan took off June 1st from Miami, Florida, with much fanfare and publicity. The plane flew towards Central and South America, turning east from Africa. From there, the plane crossed the Indian Ocean and finally touched down in Lae, New Guinea. On June 29, 1937, about 22,000 miles of the journey had been completed. The remaining 7,000 miles would take place over the Pacific. In Lae, Earhart contracted an inflammatory disease of the colon that lasted for days. While she recovered, several necessary adjustments were made to the plane. Extra amounts of fuel were stored on the board. The parachutes were packed away, for there would be no need for them while flying over the vast Pacific Ocean. The flyers' plan was to head to Howland Island, 2,556 miles away, situated between Hawaii and Australia. The island is a flat sliver of land, 1.5 miles long and half a mile wide. The island would be hard to distinguish from the familiar-looking cloud shapes. To meet this challenge, Earhart and Noonan had an elaborate plan. Star navigation would be used to track their route and keep them on course. In case of the overcast skies, they had radio communication with the U.S. Coast Guard ship Itasca stationed off Howland Island. They could also use their maps, compass, and the position of the rising sun to make an educated guess in finding their position relative to Howland Island. After aligning themselves with Howland's correct latitude, they would run north and south looking for the island and the smoke plume to be sent by the Itasca. They even had emergency plans to ditch the plane if needed be, believing empty fuel tanks would give the plane some buoyancy as well as the time to get into their small inflatable raft to wait for rescue. Earhart and Noonan set off from Leh on July 2, 1937 at 12:30 p.m., heading east toward Howland Island. Though the flyers seemed to have a well-thought-out plan, several early decisions led to the grave consequences later on. Radio equipment with shorter wavelength frequencies was left behind to allow more room for the fuel canisters. This equipment could broadcast radio signals farther distances. The Electra carried about 1,000 gallons and 50 gallons of short of full capacity. The Electra's crew ran into difficulty almost from the start. Witnesses to the July 2nd takeoff report that the radio antenna may have been damaged. It is also to believe that due to the expensive overcast conditions, Noonan might have extreme difficulty with the star navigation. If that weren't enough, it was later discovered that the flyers were using maps that may have been inaccurate. According to experts, evidence shows that the charts used by Noonan and Earhart placed Howland Island nearly 6 miles off its actual position. These circumstances led to a series of problems that couldn't be solved. As Earhart and Noonan reached the supposed position of Howland Island, they maneuvered into the north and south tracking route to find the island. They looked for visual and auditory signals from the Itasca, but for various reasons, radio communication was very poor that day. The Itasca could hear Earhart through her faint and staticky transmissions, but could not return communication. There was also confusion between Earhart and the Itasca over which frequencies to use, and a misunderstanding as to the agreed-upon check-in time. The flyers were operating on Greenwich Civil Time, and the Itasca were operating on the Naval Time Zone, which set their schedules 30 minutes apart. On the morning of July 3rd, 1937, at 7:20 a.m., Amelia reported the Electra on course at 20 miles southwest of the islands. At 7:42 a.m., the Itasca picked up the message from Earhart. "We must be on you, but we cannot see you. Fuel is running low. Been unable to reach you by radio. We are flying at 1,000 feet. The ship replied, but there are no indication that Amelia heard this. The flyer's last communication was at 8:43 a.m. It's believed that Earhart and Noonan thought they were running along the north and south line. The Itasca released its oil burners in an attempt to signal the flyers. They apparently did not see it. In all likelihood, their tanks ran out of fuel and they had to ditch into the sea. On July 2nd, 1937, 22 days before her 40th birthday and already completing 22,000 miles of her attempt to fly around the world, Earhart and her navigator, Fred Noonan, disappeared over the Pacific, somewhere between Lae, New Guinea and Howland Island. When the Itasca realized they had lost contact, they began immediate search, the largest search ever conducted by the U.S. Navy for a single missing plane. The search crew consisted of 66 aircrafts and 9 ships. An estimated $4 million was authorized by President Franklin D. Roosevelt for the search. But nothing was ever found. The initial search ended on July 19, 1937, but George Putnam, Earhart's husband, financed additional search efforts, working off the tips of the naval experts, even sidekicks, in attempt to find his wife. In October 1937, he acknowledged that any chance of Earhart and Noonan's survival was gone. On July 5, 1938, Amelia Earhart was declared legally dead by the Superior Court in Los Angeles. Since her disappearance, many theories have been formed regarding to Earhart's last days. Two seem to have the greatest credibility. One is that the plane Earhart and Noonan were flying was ditched or crashed, and the two perished at sea. Another one was several aviation and navigation experts support this theory, saying that there is an outcome of the last leg of the flight came down to the poor planning, worse execution. Investigators concluded that the Electro aircraft was not fully fueled and they could not make it to the Howland Island, even the conditions were ideal. The fact that there are many issues creating difficulties, leading investigators to the conclusion that the plane simply ran out of fuel some 35 to 100 miles off the coast of Howland Island. There has been many expeditions to locate the plane using sonar and deep-sea robots around the area, but nothing has turned up. Another theory is that Earhart and Noonan might have flown without radio transmission for some time after the last radio signal, landing at the uninhabited reef, a tiny island in the Pacific Ocean, 350 miles southeast of the Howland Island. In 1940, a British officer found a part of a skeleton on the island, as well as parts of a man's shoe, a woman's shoe, and a navigational tool. A doctor believed that the skeleton was a male, so American authorities were never notified. The bones have been lost since. In 2017, a research team took bone-sniffing dogs to the island, and all 4 dogs went to the same tree. The British officer found the partial skeleton. Soil samples were taken and sent to a lab in Germany. A scientist looked over the original report of the bones found in 1940. From all the data gathered, it looked like the bones were from the white, northern European female. A strong possibility that it was Amelia. This theory is also supported by several on-site investigations held since 1988. The expeditions have turned up artifacts such as improvised tools, bits of clothing, an aluminum panel, and a piece of plexiglass, the exact width and curvature of an electro window. In May 2012, investigators found a jar of freckled cream on a remote island near to their other findings that investigators believe belong to Earhart. Other less credible theories are that Earhart was on a spy mission to the Marshall Island authorized by President Roosevelt and was captured by the Japanese troops. A picture was found in the National Archives in July of 2017, and researchers thought it was of Earhart and Noonan as prisoners of the Japanese. The National Archives does not know the date of the photograph or the photographer who took it. The mystery of Amelia Earhart's disappearance may never be solved, but she will always be a prominent icon.